The eye is the organ of sight. But in the philosophy of many ancient cultures, it also symbolized understanding, awareness, awakening. In Egyptian mythology, the Eye of Horus is connected with an ancient legend. A legend about the struggle between the gods. Horus, the sky god, fought with his uncle Seth. During this battle Horus lost his eye. But later the god of wisdom Thoth restored it. And this restored eye became a symbol of wholeness. A symbol of the restoration of order. Sometimes this legend is perceived as a mythological story. But some researchers believe it may have a symbolic meaning. The lost eye, the restored eye, as if it is about the restoration of knowledge, about the return of understanding. Sometimes such myths are seen as metaphors. Metaphors for the inner path, the path of consciousness, the path of seeking truth. And perhaps that is why the ancient Egyptians attached such importance to symbols. Because a symbol is able to convey a complex idea, even when words are powerless. But if you look at Egyptian temples even more attentively, you can notice that symbols rarely exist in isolation. They are almost always found next to other images. Gods, priests, stars, animals, plants, all this forms a complex system. A system in which every element is connected with another. And perhaps that is how the ancient Egyptians saw the world. As a system of interconnections. As a reflection of the cosmos. Sometimes philosophers call this the principle of microcosm and macrocosm. The idea that a person is a reflection of the universe. That the processes occurring within us may be similar to the processes occurring in the cosmos. Interestingly, a similar idea is found in other ancient cultures. In Hermetic philosophy there is a well-known phrase, as above, so below. As within, so without. This thought suggests that the universe may be arranged according to unified principles. And perhaps that is why ancient civilizations paid such attention to symbols. Because a symbol can connect different levels of reality. Material, psychological, cosmic. But if the ancient Egyptians really regarded symbols as keys to understanding the world, another question arises. How did they use these symbols? Were they simply a part of art? Or did they play a role in rituals? In ceremonies? In spiritual practices? Because if you look at the images inside temples, you can notice scenes where priests perform intricate rites. They use objects. They use plants. They use sacred words. And sometimes it occurs to one that ancient symbols may have been part of practices. Practices aimed at altering the state of consciousness. Practices that helped people experience special inner states. States in which a person feels connected to something greater. To the cosmos. To nature. To the gods. And if that is truly so, then ancient symbols may have been not just decorations of temples. They could have been a kind of maps. Maps of inner journey. A journey undertaken by priests. A journey that, perhaps, was meant to lead a person to understanding the nature of reality. But if symbols really played such a role, then another question arises. What practices did the ancient priests use? What methods helped them enter these states? What rituals could have taken place inside temples and pyramids? And perhaps one of the keys to this mystery is hidden in another symbol of ancient Egypt. In the symbol of a flower. A flower that is often depicted on ancient frescoes. A flower that the Egyptians considered sacred. The blue lotus. Among all the symbols of ancient Egypt, there is one that at first seems simple. It is a flower. Delicate. Fragile. Slim. But in Egyptian temples this flower appears again and again. On walls. On columns. On sarcophagi. In the hands of gods. In the hands of priests. This flower is the blue lotus. For the ancient Egyptians, it was not just a plant. It was a symbol. A symbol of awakening. A symbol of birth. A symbol of light. The lotus grows in water. It rises from dark silt. And opens upon the surface. Every morning its petals open toward the sun. And in the evening they close again. For the Egyptians, this was a reflection of the cosmic cycle. The cycle of light and darkness. The cycle of life. The cycle of rebirth. In some myths it is said that the world itself emerged from the lotus. According to ancient texts, in the beginning there was an endless ocean. The ocean of primordial chaos. And from this ocean rose the lotus flower. When it opened, from it appeared the sun god. Ra, light arose from the flower. and the world began its existence. Of course, this myth can be taken as a poetic story, as a beautiful image, but some researchers draw attention to another aspect, to how exactly this flower is depicted on ancient frescoes. In many scenes, priests are shown bringing the lotus to their faces, as if inhaling its fragrance. Sometimes pharaohs are depicted with the flower near their nose, and these images are repeated quite often. This makes some researchers wonder, could this flower have played a special role in rituals? Could it have been used in ceremonies? Could it have helped people enter special states of consciousness? Today it is known that the blue lotus indeed contains certain natural substances. Some of them can affect mood, relaxation, perception. Of course, we cannot say with certainty how exactly the ancient Egyptians used this plant. But the very possibility that plants could play a role in spiritual practices is found in many cultures. In the ancient world, people often used plants in rituals, in meditations, in ceremonies, sometimes for healing, sometimes for spiritual experience. If you imagine an ancient Egyptian temple, tall columns, stone walls, torches, the scent of incense, priests in long robes, quiet chants. In such an atmosphere, a person could gradually enter a special state. A state of concentration, a state of inner silence, a state in which thoughts slow down, and attention becomes deeper. Sometimes such states are called altered states of consciousness. They can arise during meditation, during rituals, during prolonged concentration, and many ancient cultures considered such states to be a way to approach the divine world, the world of the gods. Perhaps that is why ancient priests paid so much attention to rituals. Music, scents, symbols, all these elements could help a person to focus, shift attention, enter a special state of perception. And if you bring all this together, symbols, pyramids, rituals, the blue lotus, an intriguing hypothesis arises. What if the ancient Egyptians used special practices to contact the world of the gods? Of course, this sounds like a bold assumption, but in ancient texts, visions are often mentioned, revelations, messages from the gods. Pharaohs were considered mediators between worlds. It was believed that they could receive wisdom from the gods. Priests performed complex ceremonies. Sometimes these ceremonies lasted all night. Sometimes they took place in the closed sanctuaries of temples. And perhaps it was in such places that the most mysterious events of ancient Egypt occurred. Events we know only through symbols, through images, through texts. But even if we assume that rituals did indeed play an important role, another question remains. How exactly did the ancient Egyptians imagine the world of the gods? Where was this world located? Was it part of the sky, part of the cosmos, or did the Egyptians believe that the divine world existed beside our own? But on another level of reality, in ancient texts, the idea of several worlds sometimes appears. The world of people, the world of the gods, the world of the afterlife. These worlds could intersect, could interact, sometimes through rituals, sometimes through dreams, sometimes through special states of consciousness. And if the ancient priests truly sought to establish contact with the world of the gods, then an even more interesting thought arises. Perhaps, for them, gods were not merely symbols, but beings who possessed knowledge, beings who could convey wisdom to humans. Of course, today we perceive such stories as mythology. But sometimes mythology can preserve ancient views of the world, views that gradually turned into legends. And if at least part of these legends reflect real events of antiquity, then one of the most enigmatic questions in all the history of Egypt arises. Who were those beings whom the Egyptians called gods? Were they only symbols of natural forces? Or do ancient texts hint at something more? At the possibility that ancient civilizations could once have come into contact with beings from other worlds. And if such contacts did indeed occur, then ancient temples and pyramids might have served not only as sacred places, but also as a kind of points of connection, places where interaction took place between humans and something much more mysterious. But to come closer to understanding this idea, we need to consider another important part of Egyptian culture. Concepts of the gods, of those beings who, according to ancient texts, once lived alongside people. and perhaps even imparted to them the first knowledge about the world. When we try to understand ancient Egypt, sooner or later we encounter the most mysterious element of this civilization. Its gods. For the Egyptians, the gods were not abstract ideas. They were considered part of reality. Beings who once were present in the world. Beings who participated in the creation of order. In the creation of civilization. In the creation of Egypt itself. If we look attentively at ancient texts, we can notice one interesting feature. The Egyptians rarely spoke of the gods as completely invisible entities. On the contrary, they described them in considerable detail. Each god had its own role, its own story, its own sphere of influence. Ra was considered the god of the sun. According to myth, he traveled across the sky each day in a solar boat. And at night he passed through the underworld, where he fought the forces of chaos. Osiris was considered the god of the afterlife, the god of rebirth, the god of eternal life. Anubis was the guardian of the transition between life and death. He accompanied the souls of the deceased and helped them on their journey to the afterlife. Thoth was considered the god of wisdom, the god of writing, the god of knowledge. It was believed that he gave people writing and taught them to understand the language of symbols. Horus was the god of the sky, the god of royal power, a symbol of protection, and the patron of pharaohs. But there is one detail that makes the Egyptian gods especially unusual. Their appearance. Many of them were depicted as beings with a human body and the head of an animal. Anubis had the head of a jackal. Horus, the head of a falcon. Thoth, the head of an ibis. Sekhmet, the head of a lioness. To the modern person, such depictions may look strange. But for the Egyptians they held deep meaning. Animals symbolized certain qualities. The falcon, vision and height. The jackal, connection with the world of the dead. The lioness, strength. The ibis, wisdom and watchfulness. But at times another question arises. Why these forms in particular? Why are the gods of Egypt so different from the gods of other ancient cultures? In Greek mythology the gods looked almost like humans. In Roman mythology as well. But in Egypt the images were much more unusual. As if ancient artists tried to combine different forms of life. Human, animal, and perhaps even something more. Some researchers believe that such depictions were purely symbolic, allegorical, but there is another hypothesis. A hypothesis that sounds much more enigmatic. What if these images were an attempt to describe beings whom ancient people actually saw? Beings who differed from ordinary humans. Of course, we have no proof for such a version. But the very idea that ancient civilizations could encounter extraordinary beings appears in many cultures. In legends. In myths, in ancient texts, sometimes these beings are described as coming from the sky, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as creators, and almost always they are connected with the transmission of knowledge. For example, in some Egyptian legends it is said that the gods ruled Egypt long before the appearance of the pharaohs. This time was called the era of the gods. After it came the era of demigods. And only then did the era of human rulers begin. Of course, such stories can be seen as mythology, as a symbolic description of the past. But at times an interesting thought arises. What if these legends were a way to preserve the memory of distant events? Of events that gradually turned into legends. Another interesting detail is connected with the role of the pharaohs. Pharaohs were not considered ordinary rulers. They were called living gods. It was believed that they were the incarnation of Horus on earth. And after death became Osiris. Thus the pharaoh was not simply a king. He was a mediator between worlds, between people and gods. It was through the pharaoh, as the Egyptians believed, that the divine order of Maat was maintained on earth. The pharaoh performed rituals, visited temples, communicated with priests, and sometimes it is thought that it was the priests who helped the pharaoh receive divine revelations. In ancient temples there were closed sanctuaries. Places where only initiates could enter. Their ceremonies were held. Their sacred texts were read. Their rituals took place, the meaning of which is not fully understood even today. Some researchers suggest that such rituals could have been aimed at establishing contact with the divine world. Contact with those whom the Egyptians called gods. And if at least some of these rituals were indeed connected with attempts to communicate with higher powers, then one of the most enigmatic questions in all history arises. Who were these gods? Were they only symbols of natural forces? Of the sun, the sky, the river? Or do ancient texts hint at the existence of more advanced beings? Beings who might have possessed knowledge and technologies unavailable to the ancient world. Of course, modern science treats such hypotheses with caution. But the very idea that ancient civilizations could receive knowledge from an external source continues to be discussed. Because in different cultures of the world similar stories can be found. Stories of heavenly teachers, stories of gods who came from the sky, stories of gods who one day disappeared. And if at least some of these stories reflect the real beliefs of ancient people, then another question arises. If the gods really were once part of human history, why did they disappear? Why do ancient texts speak of times when gods lived alongside people, but later eras speak of them only as legends? Perhaps the answer to this question is hidden in the change of civilization itself, in the change of its knowledge, in the change of its views about the world. Or perhaps this mystery is connected with events that happened thousands of years ago. Events we know only through fragments of texts, through symbols, through temples, and through massive stone structures that still stand in the desert. Structures that perhaps were built not only as monuments, but also as reminders of a time when the world of people and the world of gods could have been much closer to one another. And if this is indeed so, then ancient Egypt may hold one of the oldest secrets of human history. The secret of the origin of knowledge, the secret of the origin of civilization, and the secret of those whom ancient people called gods. Speaking of ancient Egypt, it is impossible to ignore another structure, which for thousands of years has caused wonder and questions. This is the Great Sphinx. It lies on the Giza Plateau, motionless, silent, like a guardian watching over time, the body of a lion, the head of a human, and a gaze directed to the east, to where the sun rises every morning. The Sphinx is considered one of the oldest monuments of Egypt, but many mysteries still surround it. The first mystery is connected with its form. Why a lion? Why a human face? And why are these two forms combined in one being? In ancient cultures, the lion often symbolized strength, power, royal authority. It was considered one of the strongest animals, a being that dominates over others. Therefore, the body of a lion could symbolize strength. But the human face adds another meaning: consciousness, mind, understanding. If you combine these two elements, you get the image of a being that combines the strength of nature and the mind of man. A being that possesses both power and wisdom. Some researchers believe that the Sphinx might have symbolized the pharaoh. The pharaoh as keeper of strength and knowledge. But there is another mystery: the age of the Sphinx. The traditional story says it was built during the reign of Pharaoh Khafra, about 4,500 years ago. But some geologists draw attention to traces of erosion on the body of the Sphinx. These traces look like the result of prolonged exposure to water. And in Egypt it rarely rains. Therefore, some researchers suggest that the Sphinx could be much older. Perhaps it was created in an era when the climate in this part of Africa was more humid. Such ideas remain the subject of debate. But the very possibility that the Sphinx could be older than the pyramids makes this history even more mysterious. If we imagine that the Sphinx does indeed belong to an earlier epoch, then an interesting thought arises. Perhaps the Giza Plateau was used by people long before the appearance of the known pharaohs. Perhaps there existed earlier cultures here, cultures about which we know very little. Another interesting feature of the Sphinx is connected with its orientation. It looks strictly to the east, to the point where the sun rises. Every morning the first rays of light fall directly on its face. For the ancient Egyptians, the sun was a symbol of life, a symbol of rebirth. Every new dawn meant the victory of light over darkness. And perhaps that is why the Sphinx was oriented in this way, as if it is observing the birth of a new day. But sometimes another thought arises. What if the orientation of the Sphinx is connected not only with the sun, but also with the sky? Some researchers suggest that the Giza Plateau may be connected with certain astronomical alignments. For example, Sometimes the possible connection between the location of the pyramids and the stars of Orion's belt is discussed. Such ideas remain debatable, but they show an interesting thing. The ancient Egyptians paid great attention to the sky. They observed the stars. They created maps of the heavens. They linked the movement of celestial bodies with life on Earth. And perhaps that is why many of their structures are oriented with such precision. But the Sphinx remains a mystery not only because of its form and orientation. There is another interesting story connected to this monument. For centuries the Sphinx was almost completely buried in sand. Only its head remained above the surface. At times it was excavated. At times the sand covered it again. But in ancient texts there is mention that between the paws of the Sphinx there once stood a special stela. A stone slab with text. This stela is known as the Dream Stela. It was set up by Pharaoh Thutmose IV. According to the inscription, a young prince once fell asleep near the Sphinx. And in his dream the Sphinx itself appeared to him. It said that if the prince freed it from the sand, he would become pharaoh. After that, Thutmose indeed ordered the monument to be cleared, and soon became ruler of Egypt. Of course, such a story can be seen as a legend. But it shows the significance the ancient Egyptians attached to the Sphinx. It was considered not just a statue. It was considered a living symbol, a keeper of knowledge, a keeper of mysteries. Sometimes an even bolder hypothesis arises. What if the Sphinx was part of a more complex system? A system connected with the Giza Plateau? Because near it are the pyramids, temples, underground structures. Some researchers suggest that there may be hidden chambers under the Giza Plateau. Tunnels, underground spaces. Sometimes such ideas appear in news reports. Sometimes they are only partially confirmed. But the very possibility that unknown structures may lie hidden under the sands of Egypt continues to inspire researchers. And if we imagine that the Giza Plateau was indeed the center of an ancient complex, then the Sphinx could have played a special role. The role of a guardian of ancient knowledge, a guardian of the entrance to a sacred space. And perhaps that is why its image was so unusual. Because it unites two worlds. The world of strength, and the world of consciousness. The world of nature, and the world of mind. And if the ancient Egyptians really created their structures as a reflection of cosmic order, then the Sphinx could be a symbol of this connection. The connection between man, nature, and the universe. But even if we do not know the exact answer to these questions, one thing remains obvious. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that strove to understand the structure of the world. Through architecture, through symbols, through myths. And perhaps that is why its monuments still make us ask new questions. Questions about the past, questions about knowledge, and questions about what role ancient structures might have played in the history of human civilization. But if the pyramids and the Sphinx were indeed part of a more complex system, then the next question arises. What knowledge might have been hidden behind this system? And could the ancient Egyptians have possessed an understanding of the cosmos that far surpassed their time?